We're going to talk about sacrifice, not the sacrifices where you take an animal and you put it on the altar, but the sacrifices that we make for our Judaism and for Hashem. It's what we call Mesiras Nefesh, which means to hand over your nefesh, your being, your identity, to hand over to God. The reason we're going to talk about that is because at the end of the parasha this week, you have the story that is the core story of personal sacrifice for God. And it's a story we all know, and that's the problem, because when it's a story or a piece of the Torah that we all know, that's exactly when we don't understand it properly. And that's what we're going to see over here. We're going to analyze the story and poke holes in the version that we already think we know so we can actually understand the story properly. So what have we got at the end of the parasha this week? It's called the Akedah. It's such a significant part of Judaism that it forms part of our morning davening. Before we get to shul and we actually start the communal prayers, we read the story of the Akedah every single morning. What's the story of the Akedah? Here is Avraham, who has dedicated himself to Hashem for over a century. During that time, he has experienced some of the greatest challenges that any human being has had to experience in terms of commitment to Hashem. He has had to kick out his own son Yishmael because Sarah said that Yishmael was a bad influence over Yitzchak. He had to leave his home and everything that was familiar to him when he was 75 years old and go to a place that Hashem designated without telling him in advance where he was going. And then when he eventually got there and discovered it was the land of Canaan, there was a famine and he had to immediately leave, which was obviously a great test of faith. He had to go fight against the kings who had abducted his nephew Lot, etc., etc. His life is full of challenges. And we're told that the ultimate challenge out of all of them is the story of the Akedah, which is where Hashem comes to Avraham and he says to him, Kachna es bincha, I want you to take your son, es yechidcha, the son that is unique to you, asher ahavta, the son that you love, Yitzchak, and I want you to take him up onto Mount Moriah, and I want you to bring him as an offering. Now this is a tremendous test for anybody. Now, can you imagine anybody being faced with that kind of an expectation that they're going to, God forbid, take their own child and sacrifice their child to God? But add to that, we're talking about Avraham over here. Avraham is the epitome of chesed. He's the nicest, kindest, most generous, most benevolent human that you'll ever find. So to take his son and to offer to even consider the possibility of killing his son is the exact antithesis of everything that his life is about. Plus, you've got to take into consideration the context. We're dealing with a period in history where child sacrifice was a sign of idolatry, and Avraham had dedicated his entire life to fighting idolatry. So just from that perspective, this is a very uncomfortable situation for him. So it's a very, very major test, and at the end of this test, Hashem says to him, Ato yodaiti ki irei elikim. Ato, now I know that you are truly God-fearing, which implies that this is the test that culminates all of the other tests and challenges that he experienced in his life. So we're going to start our conversation this morning with a quotation in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that picks out one word in the instruction that Hashem gives to Avraham to take his son and to put him onto this altar. There's one word that glares at us because it really doesn't fit. What's the one word? The word is no. Kach no es bincha. Take, kach, take, es bincha, your son. What does no mean? Please. Please take your son. Now, usually when Hashem tells us to do something, Hashem does not say please. For example, Hashem does not say please keep kosher. He says these are the animals you can eat, those are animals you can't eat. He says meat and milk you may not have together. He doesn't say please. He doesn't say please keep Shabbos or please don't murder. That's why they're called instructions. A mitzvah is an instruction. Yet over here, Hashem tells him, please take your son. He didn't tell him, please lech lecha, please leave your family. Here he uses the word please. So the Gemara wants to know why. Why does he use the word please? And the Gemara answers that the reason for that is that Hashem said, or implied in this message to Avraham, please make sure that you actually pass this test. Because if you don't, then people will assume that the previous tests ein bohem mamash. They were insubstantial. They weren't real. And effectively, what the Gemara is telling us is, and you know this also from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, that Hashem gave Avraham through the course of his life 10 major tests. This is the 10th out of those tests. And so what he's saying is, if you don't pass this test, then all the others are as if they never happened. Now, I don't know about you, but where I come from, 90% is also a good result. Right? You get a 90% on a test, you've done pretty well. So how is it fair to say to Abraham that if you get 9 out of the 10 tests right, and some of them were incredibly difficult, to distance his own son, or to go risk his life to rescue his nephew, or whatever. There's different versions of what belongs on the list of the 10 tests, but there were some very serious things over there. If Abraham was willing to sacrifice himself for Hashem 9 times over, and only at the 10th time, which is this mega test, which quite frankly, any normal sane person should completely reject this test. So now we're going to say everything is worth nothing. How's that fair? Let's take this a step further. One of the earliest tests was alluded to. It's not told to us directly in the Torah. It's alluded to in the Torah. But the one of the earliest tests is where Avraham, because he'd been out spreading his belief in monotheism, so he runs into Nimrod, who was the king at the time. And Nimrod is not happy with Abraham because Nimrod declared himself as a god. And here's this man, Abraham, telling everybody there's no such thing, and there's no idols, and there's no thing. There's only a single God who created heaven and earth, and he's invisible, and he's omniscient, and he's infinite, and so on and so forth. So Nimrod took this personally, and he summons Abraham to the palace, and he says to him, is this what you believe? Do you really believe that there's only one God? And of course he says yes. And Nimrod says to him, this is in a place called Ur-Kasdim, he says to him, well, if that's the case, I'm going to throw you into a furnace. So Abraham says, go ahead, do what you've got to do, but I'm not changing my views. Now, is that not absolute sacrifice for Hashem? How could you possibly suggest that if Abraham's not willing to slaughter his own son, then that sacrifice that he was willing to be thrown into a furnace, he didn't know that Hashem was going to miraculously save his life. He went into the furnace out of his belief and commitment to Hashem. You're telling me that's worth nothing? Because he might not have the level of dedication required to slaughter his own son, which is an insane level of dedication. How could the Gemara suggest that if Avraham does not slaughter his son, everything else is worthless? So this is a big question, because what it does is not only question the story and the scenario and what was going on with Abraham, but it actually questions how we are supposed to understand sacrifice. What does it mean to make a sacrifice for God? How is it possible that a person could die for Hashem, and that's not good enough if they're not willing to kill their child for Hashem? And maybe that's the answer. Maybe that's exactly the point. It's easier for a person to do something that harms themselves than to do something that harms their child. Maybe that's the answer. So let's see. In order to understand this, what we're going to do first is we're going to try and appreciate, why does Abraham get all the airtime? In other words, our history, unfortunately, Jewish history, is a blood-soaked history. And out of all of the generations across the span of history, there are thousands of individuals who sacrificed their lives for God. Some of them are very famous. For example, on Yom Kippur, in the middle of the Avodah, which is that long section that we daven on Yom Kippur, we speak about the Asara Harugei Malchus, the 10 individuals, 10 great sages who were brutally murdered by the Romans. And maybe the best known out of all of them is Rabbi Akiva. Why don't we ever speak in our prayers about the sacrifice that Rabbi Akiva made for Hashem? Because you might remember, Rabbi Akiva had the opportunity to escape. Rabbi Akiva, one of his students, or I don't know if it was one of his students, one of the Jews at the time, came over to Rabbi Akiva and he says, well, maybe if you stopped teaching Torah, which was illegal at that time, you wouldn't be held, you wouldn't be arrested, you wouldn't be... And he says, no, you've got to teach Torah, because Torah is like water, and just as you cannot survive without water, so you cannot survive without Torah. And as a result, Rabbi Akiva is captured by the Romans, and he is murdered in the most brutal fashion. And the Gemara tells us that at the time that they're literally ripping his skin off his body with these massive iron combs, his students say to him, Rabbi Akiva, how do you manage this? How do you handle this? And Rabbi Akiva is completely balanced and is completely calm and is actually happy with what's going on. And he says, well, every single day in the Shema, we say that you're supposed to serve Hashem b'chol nafshecha, that you're supposed to serve Hashem or love Hashem to the extent of all of your soul. What does it mean, all of your soul? Afilu noita les nafshecha, that even if Hashem creates a situation where he's going to take your life, that's how you dedicate. He says, my whole life I was waiting for this opportunity. So why don't we take somebody like Rabbi Akiva and put him into our daily prayers as well, to say this is considered sacrifice? Why does Avraham get all the airtime? What did Avraham do that nobody else did in terms of their sacrifice to Hashem? So if we could understand that, if we could appreciate the greatness of Avraham's sacrifice, that would probably help us answer the question of why this 10th test was such a make it or break it. In other words, we first have to have the context. So the question is, what makes Avraham so unique in his dedication to Hashem? You cannot say it's the willingness to give up his life, because unfortunately Jewish history has so many examples of people who gave up their life for Hashem. That cannot be the answer. So let's think about it for a second. What do you think makes Abraham's sacrifice so special?
Maybe he was the first.
Oh, very good. Okay? So maybe the fact is that he was the first person to do so. And generally speaking, when somebody's the first person to do something, it's obviously much more difficult. You see this all the time. You see that when a person breaks a world record, then shortly after that, you get somebody who breaks their record. But in order to break the record in the first place, it's this major shift that has to happen, and until that happens, nobody else seems capable of getting anywhere close. And that's how it is in human psychology. When somebody prior to us has done something, then it makes it a lot easier for us to do something similar. So maybe that's the answer, right? Maybe it's because he was the first. And we're going to come back to that. We're going to circle back to that, please God, tomorrow. What's so big about being the first? What else? What else jumps out at you about Avraham that makes his sacrifice so special? Okay, so let's look at a few options. Number one, maybe what's so unique about Avraham is that it wasn't about sacrificing himself, but that it was about sacrificing his child. And as I've already mentioned, sometimes it's easier to do something painful to ourselves than it is to put our children through something painful. So the level of dedication that is required in order to be able to sacrifice a child is obviously a higher level of dedication than what is required in order to sacrifice oneself. Maybe that's the big deal over here. And maybe that's the reason why, if he wouldn't make this particular test, it's a big deal, because it tells us that he's willing to dedicate himself to this level, but not to that level. Okay, what do you think of that suggestion?
But also, it's his only child.
Well, he has Yishmael as well.
But Ishmael's not there anymore.
Okay, so you're saying Yishmael's not part of the legacy.
No.
Okay, fine. But Yishmael is physically present. Yishmael actually comes with them on the way to accompany them to the mountain. So he's not completely out of the picture.
Could you imagine what would have happened if he had gone through this? Good point. What would have happened if he actually did it? Have had a Jewish nation?
Correct. So we're going to talk about that, please God, tomorrow. Okay, that's a really good point. What had happened if he actually did it? Well, we wouldn't be having this year for a start, right? Okay, good point. The thing is this, Abraham is not the only person in Jewish history who sacrificed his child. That's the reality. In fact, when I talk about a blood-soaked history, if you read that history, we have multiple stories of individuals who actually gave up their children's lives for their Judaism. Maybe the most famous is the one that's brought in the Gemara in Gittin. There was a woman called Hannah. You can go to Tzfat, and in the ancient cemetery of Tzfat, there's a section that is identified as the place of Hannah and her 7 sons. And the story is, this is during the time of the Greek occupation, and they wanted everybody to serve their idols. And Hannah had these 7 boys, ranging in age all the way to a little child. And they were brought one by one in front of the king, and each of them was challenged to bow to the idol that he had. And Hannah was obviously there encouraging her children not to do so. And one by one, they were killed in front of her eyes. And eventually, when it came to the youngest child, the king dropped his ring on the floor, and he said, you just pick up the ring, and then everybody will think that you bow down to the idol, but actually you're picking up the ring, and then I don't have to kill you. And he refused. And her youngest child was killed in front of her as well. And the Gemara says that at that point, Hannah said these words. She said, Hashem, our forefather Abraham brought one altar, referring to the Akedah, to Yitzchak. And even then, he didn't actually kill him. And I have now brought 7 altars in front of you. Now, that surely is a far more extreme level of dedication to Hashem than even Abraham did. So you can't say that what makes his dedication so unique is the fact that he was willing to sacrifice his child, because he didn't actually have to kill him in the end. And there are people in our history who did. So Hannah is just probably the most well-known example. But if you have a look through our history, including some of the things that we read about on Tisha B'Av, when we read through the Kinois on Tisha B'Av, part of what we read about is individuals who gave up their children's lives because they wanted to remain dedicated to the Judaism.
Rabbi, is this the same Hannah from the story on Rosh Hashanah?
No. The story on Hannah of Rosh Hashanah is quite a few centuries before that. That's before the building of the Beis Hamikdash, and this is after the occupation of the Beis Hamikdash, second temple, much later. Okay, so you can't tell me that the thing over here is that he was willing to sacrifice his child. Here's another possibility. Maybe the reason that Avraham is held in such high esteem because of his sacrifice is because nobody told him that he had to make a sacrifice. In other words, it was his own voluntary commitment. Now, as Jews today, we have a principle of what is called Yehareg Va'al Yavor, that there are certain circumstances where the Torah expects us to give up our lives rather than to transgress. And one of the most common of those is idolatry. So if a person threatens us that we have to serve an idol or join another religion, or else they're going to kill us, so the Torah mandates that we have to be willing to give up our lives. So maybe that's the difference, because when you're doing something that you are expected to do, it's not as big a deal than when you're doing something that you're not expected to do. In other words, at that time, Abraham was not yet instructed by Hashem that there was a concept of what's called Kiddush Hashem, dying for the sake of God. So the fact that he was willing to do so, maybe that's what makes him so special, is the fact that he went ahead and he volunteered and he was ready to do it without it being required. Maybe that's what makes Abraham so great. But again, if you read the morbid history of Judaism, and I'm not saying, God forbid, that Judaism is morbid, but there are so many morbid chapters of Jewish history, you will discover that there were so many people through the course of our history who died for Judaism under circumstances where it is unclear if you are required to do so. In fact, there are huge debates in halachic literature about circumstances under which a person may not have to sacrifice their life. And you know what the problem is? That if a person is not required to sacrifice their life and they go ahead and do so, you have the possibility of it being suicide. So it's not necessarily always a positive thing. And that's why there's so much literature to discuss the scenarios where people were ready to step up to the plate and were ready to dig their heels in and say, we are not going to tolerate the expectation of X and Y, this particular transgression or that particular transgression. You don't even have to look that far. We know stories of people who were in the concentration camps, and we know stories of people who were in the gulags of Russia, and they refused to eat over Pesach because they couldn't get food that was not chometz. And sometimes people died from that because you can't go for a whole week without eating. And you could debate, is Pesach enough of a reason for a person to sacrifice their life? And yet, that's what people did. So you can't tell me that what makes Abraham's sacrifice and dedication to Hashem so incredible and so special is the fact that he was doing something that was not required, because we have we have other examples through the course of history of people who sacrificed for Hashem even when it was not required. So we're back to square one, which is the question of, why does Abraham get all the airtime? Why do we make his sacrifice into the epitome, the ultimate expression of sacrifice to Hashem? Because if we can work that out, it will help us understand why the Gemara feels that if the Akedah had not actually gone through, it would discredit all the other times that he had stood up in dedication to Hashem. Here's another possible angle on this. Why do you think Hashem says please? So the Gemara says the reason Hashem says please take your son is because the Gemara is saying please make sure that you actually pass this test, because if you don't, everything else is going to be cancelled. But there's another opinion about why it says please. Another opinion. Let's think about this for a second. If you were Avraham, and Hashem came to you and said, take Yitzchak and sacrifice him on top of the mountain. If you could have argued back with a solid reason why not to do this, what reason would you have given? Murder. Okay.
You didn't say please.
It's good. So he did say please. He did say
I'm
please.
saying if you didn't
Yeah?
say that was
Okay,
another
so
secret.
it's murder, right? What's wrong with murder? First of all, who says it's murder? The definition of murder is killing somebody in a way that is not mandated by the Torah. We have capital punishment in Judaism. Killing a person is not automatically murder. If it's killing and it's sanctioned by God, it's no longer murder. So if Hashem tells him to kill his child, it is not murder. So what's a solid argument that Abraham could have given to say, I don't actually have to do this? So let's think about it. Who is Yitzchak? Besides, obviously, the biological son of Abraham. But who's Yitzchak in the story? What's the significance of Yitzchak?
The Jews,
Okay?
the Jewish nation.
The Jewish nation, and more specifically, don't you remember what happened in last week's parasha? Where Hashem comes to Avraham and he tells him, you're going to have a son with Sarah. And Avraham says, I don't need the miracle of another child when I'm 99 years old and Sarah is 90 years old. I don't need that miracle. All I need is, Lu Yishmael Yichyeh Lefonecha. Let Yishmael just live a proper life of dedication to Hashem. Let him be a decent person, and I'll be satisfied with that. Hashem says to Avraham, he says, no, that's not the way it's going to work. Ki beYitzchak yikarei lecha zara. Yitzchak is going to be the one who will be considered your legacy. He'll be the one who's considered your dynasty. He is the one who's going to continue everything that you stand for, not Yishmael. So what could Avraham say to Hashem?
Why are you doing
You
this?
said
You said, you promised me that Yitzchak's going to be the one who's going to continue everything. It's not a personal thing. It's not because it's my child and I love my child and therefore I don't want to kill my child. You made a promise to me. You are God. You are eternal. Your word is your bond. You're the one who promised me that he will continue the legacy of everything that I've built over the last century and a third. Right? He's 137 years old at this point. So everything that I've invested, you're the one who told me that it's all resting on Yitzchak. You're the one who promised me that Yitzchak will be the one to continue my physical and spiritual line. I did not ask for this. How could you now go against your promise and tell me to kill Yitzchak?
So maybe that's why I knew.
Why he knew?
Why I knew that he
Because why
could go
would he
ahead,
tell the
because he would
future?
never do it.
Okay,
Why would
so
he
you
tell
could
the future?
you could argue that he knew, but we'll see in a moment. Not in a moment. We'll see in the course of learning this that that's not as simple as that. But the fact is, maybe that's why Avraham is so great, because he could have second guessed, he could have questioned Hashem, and he would have had a really good basis to challenge Hashem's instruction, but he didn't. He zipped it, and he said, "Okay, if this is what Hashem wants, I'm going to go ahead. Not only will I go ahead, but he got up early in the morning, as the Torah tells us. Vayashkem Avraham baboiker. He got up early in the morning. He was incredibly enthusiastic. He didn't want to delay. He didn't want to allow himself to procrastinate and then maybe lose his enthusiasm and maybe not even do it in the end. The fact that he was so ready to do what Hashem had told him, even though it made absolutely no sense in his mind, because Hashem had just instructed him to do something which goes against everything Hashem had told him, he didn't question that. Maybe that's his greatness. Okay? But as we're about to discover, or we will discover over the next 2 days, please God, this is not what makes Avraham so great. And if we really want to understand what is special about the story of the Akedah, and why it is that the Akedah is the one that we say every single day in our prayers, and that the Rambam calls it, I think it's the Rambam, who calls it a cornerstone of the Jewish faith, that it's kind of a foundation that the whole of Judaism rests upon. So if we want to understand that, we're going to have to go back to our original question, which is, what is Mesiras Nefesh? What does it mean to sacrifice for Hashem? Because colloquially, we always think that to sacrifice for Hashem means the readiness to die for God. But what we'll discover through the course of this story is that there's something even more profound in terms of our commitment to Hashem and sacrifice for Hashem that is even beyond dying for Hashem. And that is embedded in the story of the Akedah, which is why if the Akedah had not happened, the whole principle of Mesiras Nefesh would have been undermined, as we shall see.